Hi, I'm Adam Kingl. I'm an academic, a teacher, researcher. I focus on the future of work. What does the workplace hold for our leaders of the future, for the youngest generations entering the workforce? To research all of these topics, I wrote a book called Next Generation Leadership. And I looked at that young generation in the workforce, the Generation Ys or Millennials, the Generation Zs, asking them, well, what do you want from work, life, careers, leadership? And what does that hold for our future of our workplace when those young employees become our leaders of the future? And it certainly offered some interesting insights. Let me just first talk a little bit about what the future of work holds. I think the big headline that I'd like to leave with you is this theme of humanizing the workforce. Humanizing is a phrase that we hear a lot, certainly in the last few years, but I question whether we're actually seeing it. So what would it actually mean to have a humanized workplace? Well, if you think about a workplace, most executives would tell us that they lack innovation, creativity, adaptability, inspiration. And yet, every single human being that is in that organization has an abundance of these qualities. So why is it that when we get together in these collective societies known as companies, we don't have those same capacities? When these human beings come together, there should be a multiplier effect. We should have even more creativity and adaptability and inspiration than we ever saw from any individual. And yet, generally, there is something about what we're doing in the workforce that creates a deficit of those characteristics that we naturally possess. And I think the difference, why we see the deficit instead of an abundance, has to do with leadership. The way in which we manage our companies is fundamentally flawed for the 21st century. Now, don't get me wrong. I think there are management principles that have served us very well for almost 200 years, but it served us for the Industrial Revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, every human being essentially needed to be a robot. It was all about conformity, efficiency, speed. We didn't need people to think. In fact, the most famous proponent of scientific management, Henry Ford, in his famous Ford auto plant in Michigan, said, "Why is it every time I hire a pair of hands, a brain comes attached?" Well, certainly that's not the way that we want to see our employees today. So, when we are humanizing leadership, the characteristics that we require, humility, curiosity, and of course, those same qualities that I mentioned earlier, like creativity, inspiration, etc., are things that we have to proactively, deliberately build in. And this is probably not a top-down initiative. It has to be in those micro moments, in the behaviors, in the way that we relate to one another every day. Culture is an extremely important part of what high potential talent seeks in an organization. And the best definition I ever heard of culture is this. It's so elegant, it's beautiful. It's just two words: shared behaviors. That's it. That's it. Shared behaviors. But that's so compelling and profound, isn't it? Because it tells us that we have to think about culture sociologically, not philosophically, not from an organizational design or an organizational architecture perspective, but in the micro moments of how colleagues relate to one another. When I asked high potential Gen Ys, what is it that you seek most? What are the questions you wish you would have been asked in a recruitment interview? They said, I wish they would have asked me some variation of one of two things. Either show me where my desk would be, this was pre-COVID lockdown, or could I meet the team that I would be working with? In both cases, what they want to know is who are the individuals that I will need to relate to on a daily basis? And would that be fulfilling or would that be enervating? So it's all about culture. I think the other area that we have to get a lot better at in terms of humanizing our workplace is so-called D&I, diversity and inclusion. And there's lots that's been written about that. And there are many conferences and programs dedicated to D&I. Well, let's talk just a little bit about that. The D, diversity, is actually relatively simple for organizations to engineer into the architecture of their organizations. That's because diversity is often a policy decision, right? It is how and who you hire. And organizations, typically being large bureaucratic organizations, are very good about creating and implementing policies. but the I, inclusion, is often ignored. We say D&I, our organization emphasizes D and I, but actually it's mainly the D. So what would a true inclusive organization look like? Well, first of all, when you bring in diversity, people from different backgrounds, people who think differently, people from different education, etc., and then you train and onboard all that difference and diversity out of them, then you are not an inclusive organization. There was actually no point in having a diverse workforce if you want everyone to be a cookie-cutter colleague. But inclusion requires humility, the idea of, I don't necessarily have all the answers, and I would like to hear your opinion. And if a senior executive says something like that, that is incredibly powerful. The other important point in terms of building in inclusion is at that magical first moment, and that's the onboarding or orientation of new employees in an organization. I don't like that phrase, onboarding. It sounds quite punitive, doesn't it? Get on board. Get with the program. Why aren't you on board? And that's because usually a so-called onboarding program is all one way. Welcome to the company. We're now going to tell you everything about ourselves in exquisite detail. You can simply be quiet and listen as we fill your head with everything we want you to do for and about us, and all the myriad ways in which we want you to conform. That's typically what orientation looks like. What if that were flipped on its head? What if in an onboarding session you walked into the room as a new colleague and people said, we'll tell you a little bit about us and this organization that you've joined. I'm sure you're curious about that, but we really want to know a lot more about you. The way in which we spoke previously in our recruitment interviews, it's a little stilted, right? You have to watch what you're saying. You're always being evaluated and you're always very conscious of that. Now we are really curious about what you can bring to the organization. And as a matter of fact, we hope that you can keep that external perspective for as long as possible. How long do we hear organizations say that? It usually doesn't happen, does it? How quickly can you get with the program? Can you get on board? Instead of, there's something very special and unique about a new colleague. They can tell us, what are we doing wrong? What could we be doing better? What are the habits and the processes and the way in which we work with one another that are kind of stupid? But that requires, again, empathy, humility, curiosity. And all of these are very human traits. So essentially where I want to get to with this is in terms of being a human organization, it's not so much about policy. It's more about emphasizing what will be the cultural norms by which we're going to agree to abide by and to hold one another accountable for. That really requires that every individual in the organization is part of that every person in the organization signs up to it, that they are willing to challenge one another when they aren't seeing certain behaviors actioned, or when they see behaviors you don't want anymore still being used. That's hard, and it certainly requires a lot of permission and a lot of vulnerability from leaders. Otherwise, the typical response, and I'm sure you can hear this coming from me, that you'll get from employees is, well, I know they're saying that, but nothing's actually going to change in practice. And if there is a disconnect between word and action, then we lose authenticity in an organization. And when you lose authenticity in an organization, you don't have trust. And if you don't have trust, people will relate to one another in artificial or stilted ways. In other words, the organization becomes less and less human. But what if, again, we flip that on its head? If we truly made that commitment to make our organizations at least as human as every human being in it, how special would that be? How unique and differentiated would it be for a company to make its work life a life that's worth living?